Part 3. Soils and Farming in Jamaica, the Geology Link. Erosion mitigation tricks through terrain map study. If you are a farmer, you should know how to observe and interpret terrain maps. Now, the tricks I'm showing you are relevant in the context of safeguarding your investments, and at the same time assisting you with your capacity of increasing the business output, the yield, etc. With this being said, here is a map of Jamaica, a terrain map. If you gloss over it, you can see the dark green areas. Dark green areas, relatively speaking, are higher in elevation. The lighter green areas that look flat, think of those areas as the flat areas. Now, as you will know as the farmers, higher elevations are generally harder to farm on relative to flatter terrain. With this being said, flatter terrain presents its own challenges. So, zooming in, look at here Westmoreland. The sections you can see, lighter green, are flatter areas. These areas you can see there are those blue lines, and that represents the rivers. So essentially, the areas of Savlamar, Little London, they will come under flood hazard or flood risk in the event of intense rainfall. Worse, that those locations are flat, it doesn't appear as if to say there are any high rise flood walls in place to prevent the floods or rather the water from breaching the riverbanks. So if you are farming anywhere near Little London, Sablamar, and or anywhere near where these rivers are, then it's likely that once we enter into rainy season or in regions where we're experiencing flash flooding, your crops will be under risk. Now, in contrast, this is the eastern section of Jamaica, and we can see that based on the nature of the color and even how the terrain looks very, very rugged, that is a representation of the hilly terrain. So, zooming in, I want you to look at these things. Like our content, please like, follow, subscribe, share, and join obfitness.com email community. Right, so now look at this image. This is a section highlighting Blue Mountain Peak. Look at those lines, sub-horizontal lines to be exact. Those are the contours, and the closeness of those lines represent the steepness of the terrain. You can see how very tightly squeezed those lines are. So this now suggests that farming along the faces of these slopes, we're talking about very steep faces of slopes here, which means that in the event of heavy rainfall, it's likely that the crops will come under threat from landslides. If you are to consider farming in where you see those little areas that appear as indentations, those little lines or those little cracks, those are the gullies. So those are the zones where you should expect the streams, tributaries, to actually become present, especially during times of rainfall. So those are no zones, or no farming zones, generally speaking, from a geo point of view. So this explains why when Jamaica experiences torrential rainfall, the slopes of the hilly terrain will experience serious damage from landslides. Not to mention that the Blue Mountain area is the area that is found within the most tectonically active region of Jamaica. So we're talking about frequent earthquakes, we're talking about highly fractured rocks, which means that the slopes themselves, are highly weathered. So from a farming point of view, it is imperative that you are applying the most robust erosion measures, such as terracing as an example, to reduce the risk of or reduce the likelihood of erosion. And even so, the fact that you can even reduce the likelihood of landslides being larger scale that will wipe out your crops. Those are things that you should consider. Now, with this being said as well, there are other things that you can apply just by using your eyes and to observe the terrain map. So look at this section. So on this terrain map, if you look at the contours, you should see that there are those zones that are tightly packed or close together, and there are those zones where you can see those little space or a little bit more space in between. So look at where Antoli is and look at the contours. Specifically there, that represents a degree of a valley or a flat space, on the fact that the contours are more so spaced in between. So from an angle of geographic, uh, I guess, presence that will indicate best place to farm, this is an example of what you look for. Now, with this being said, the fact that we can see this aspect of a terrain representation indicates that there is something else going on geologically, and that's suggesting that we have active earthquake uh, movement that takes place here. But notwithstanding that, once you look on terrain maps and you can see where there are those contours that represent those spaces that is wider than those relatively next to it that is more tighter, then that indicates that that's a much more ideal zone to farm in than the areas that you have tighter. Again, you would have heard me mention about the areas where you can see like those little indentations, where you can know that it's the zone of drainage flow. You can actually see where the drainage flow becomes blue in the form of that tributary there, right? So anywhere at all that you see the contours make what we call an upward V, that suggests that that's where water will flow. So that is something that you should be paying attention to when you are considering where you intend to farm. All right. So this is just a couple basic tricks. I hope I did not make this too complex, but do apply these when it comes to you selecting where you intend to farm, and based on where you intend to farm, whether it be hilly terrain or flat terrain, ensure that as best as is possible you observe where the drainage flows are. You also observe whether or not, based on the nature of the contours, that it can suggest that there is some tectonic activity that could be present there. That is where obviously you should liaison with your local geologic agencies or private geological entities. All right. So yes, this is just me sharing a bit of my knowledge in this respect. Take care.